Welcome to the Sex Science Podcast, where we turn the latest peer-reviewed research on intimacy and sexuality into fun, accessible conversations. Generated by AI and fact-checked by experts, the Sex Science Podcast was created by Luscious to empower you through knowledge. So, join us as we explore pleasure, relationships, human connection, and everything in between.
All right, buckle up for this one, folks. We're going to do a deep dive into some research that might just make you rethink that next trip to the salon.
Yeah, we've got a study from Yonsei University in South Korea.
Oh, wow.
Published in Frontiers in Psychology, no less. That claims there's a link between how long a wife's hair is and how often she and her husband, do the deed.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating look at how something like hairstyle, which you think is pretty superficial, can actually tie into deeper psychological and evolutionary ideas about attraction and relationships.
And you know what? Even if you're not married or even thinking about growing your hair out anytime soon, I think there's still a lot to unpack here about how we pick partners and what really drives those choices, whether we're conscious of it or not.
Right.
So this study found that wives with longer, healthier hair reported having more sex with their husbands. I don't know about you, but I definitely raised an eyebrow at that one. Makes you wonder, what's really going on beneath the surface here? Yeah, because on the surface it might seem like, oh, this is just, a matter of preference. But the researchers actually dug a little deeper. First, they found that men in the study rated their wives as more attractive when they had longer, healthier hair. And that perception of attractiveness seemed to, boost their desire. Which makes sense. I mean, we're generally more drawn to people we find attractive.
Totally. But what is it about long hair that might make someone seem more attractive? I mean, beauty standards are so different, depending on where you are in the world, right?
Exactly. And the researchers considered that, and their second explanation gets into some really interesting evolutionary psychology. They suggest that healthy hair might be seen as a sign of overall health and strong genes, which, from an evolutionary standpoint, would make someone a more desirable partner.
So maybe there's some truth to that whole healthy hair, healthy body thing.
Yeah.
But on a much deeper level than we realize.
Yeah, maybe. It speaks to this idea that we're subconsciously drawn to people who seem like they'd be good mates, good parents.
Right.
And then there's the third explanation, which brings culture into the mix. Long flowing hair has been associated with femininity in many cultures for a long time. So it's possible that those cultural expectations are also influencing how men perceive and respond to women's hair.
It's kind of wild to think about how these cultural norms that we often don't even question might be shaping something as personal as who we're attracted to. But this study was done in South Korea. I'm curious, do you think these same findings would hold up in other parts of the world, different age groups?
That's the million-dollar question. And that's definitely one of the areas where more research would be really helpful. We know beauty standards can vary so much from culture to culture, and even from generation to generation. So it's totally possible that the things that are seen as attractive in one context might not be as impactful in another. And it's worth noting, this study specifically looked at heterosexual married couples. So we need more research to understand if these findings apply to other types of relationships as well.
It's like we've only just scratched the surface here. So we've got long hair, potentially signaling health and good genes, maybe tapping into some deep-seated cultural preferences, and all of that influencing how attractive a man finds his wife. But did the researchers find anything about men's hair?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. They actually found that a husband's hair length or quality didn't seem to have the same effect on the wives.
Really?
Yeah.
It makes you think about all the societal pressures and double standards that exist around appearance, especially for women. Like, why does the length of her hair seem to matter more than the length of his hair?
Well, the researchers speculate that it could be tied to how evolution has shaped our preferences. Certain traits like youthfulness and fertility are often seen as more important in women than in men from an evolutionary perspective. And those traits are often associated with physical appearance, which might be why we see this difference in how men and women's hair is perceived.
Okay, so maybe our brains are wired to pick up on these subtle cues about potential mates, even if we're not consciously aware of it. It's a bit humbling, isn't it?
It is.
But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, I want to take a step back and talk about how the researchers actually conducted this study.
Okay, sure.
Like, how did they gather their data?
So they surveyed 204 heterosexual married couples in South Korea. asking them about things like hair length and quality, how attractive they found each other, their level of sexual desire, and how often they had sex. All of that information was collected through an online survey.
So they get a good mix of the physical and the psychological. But did they factor in any other things that might influence how often couples have sex? I mean, there are a lot of variables at play in any relationship, right?
Oh, absolutely. They also asked questions about age, relationship satisfaction, and how long the couples had been married. They wanted to make sure they were isolating the effect of hair as much as possible.
That makes sense. It's like trying to control for all the other ingredients in the recipe to see how much of a difference that one ingredient, in this case hair, really makes. So what did they find? Was there a big difference in sexual frequency between the couples with longer-haired wives and those with shorter-haired wives?
Well, that's where it gets even more nuanced. While they did find a connection, and it was statistically significant, meaning it wasn't just random chance, the effect size was relatively small.
Oh, okay.
So while there's a link, it's not a huge one.
So hair lengths might be a factor, but it's definitely not the only thing that matters when it comes to how often couples are intimate, right?
Right. Think of it as one piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture.
Okay, that makes sense. It's not a guarantee.
Yeah.
But maybe it's like a little nudge in the right direction. But there's obviously a lot more to unpack here. So let's dive even deeper in the next part of this deep dive.
It's a good reminder that attraction is this complex interplay of so many factors.
Totally. And this study isn't the first to suggest a connection between a seemingly superficial trait and some deeper evolutionary or psychological idea. I'm guessing there's a whole world of research out there exploring how evolution has shaped what we find attractive.
Oh, absolutely. There's tons of research looking at how evolution might be influencing our preferences and behaviors, especially when it comes to mating and relationships.
Do any specific studies come to mind?
Well, there's the classic study about waist-to-hip ratio. Researchers have found that men across cultures tend to be more attracted to women with a particular waist-to-hip ratio. And guess what? That ratio is linked to fertility and health.
So it's not just about curves for the sake of curves. It's about those subconscious signals of a potential mate's ability to bear children.
Exactly. It seems like our brains are wired to notice those subtle cues, even if we're not aware of it.
It's amazing to think how much of our behavior might still be driven by these ancient instincts, even in the modern world.
It really is. Makes you wonder how much control we really have over who we find attractive.
Right. Like, are we really making these choices consciously, or are we just playing out some evolutionary script that's been written for us? But let's circle back to the hair study for a moment. I'm curious, did the researchers just ask about how often couples had sex? Or did they dig into other aspects of their intimate lives?
They looked at a few other factors, including sexual desire and satisfaction. And while the main focus was on frequency, they did find a correlation between the wife's hair quality and how much sexual desire the husband reported feeling towards her. It's important to remember that this was a correlational study, meaning we can't definitively say that longer hair caused the increased sexual frequency. There could be other factors involved that weren't measured.
Right. Correlation doesn't equal causation. There could be other explanations for the connection they found.
Exactly. Maybe couples who have more sex are also more likely to prioritize their appearance, including hair care. Or maybe there's some other underlying factor that influences both hair health and sexual activity.
Maybe happier couples just tend to have better hair and more sex.
It's certainly possible. To really prove that hair length directly causes changes in sexual frequency, you'd need to do a controlled experiment, which is a lot trickier than a survey.
True. But even if we can't say for certain that there's a direct cause and effect relationship, the correlation itself is still pretty interesting.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not a magic bullet for a better sex life.
Definitely not. But it does give us something to think about. It reminds us that even seemingly small details can have a big impact on our perceptions and behaviors, especially in relationships.
It's like that saying, the devil's in the details.
Exactly. We shouldn't underestimate the power of subtle cues, both conscious and unconscious, in our interactions with others.
Speaking of details, I remember the study mentioned that the link between hair and sex was statistically significant, but relatively small. What does that mean for the average listener, who might be wondering if they need to make a beeline for the salon?
It's an important point. While the researchers found a real connection, the size of the effect was fairly small. So, while there might be something to it, hair length is probably just a small piece of a much bigger puzzle when it comes to attraction and sexual desire.
So a haircut probably isn't going to magically transform anyone's sex life.
Right. It's important to have realistic expectations.
But it sounds like taking care of your appearance, including your hair,
Yeah,
could be a way of showing your partner that you care about yourself and the relationship.
that's a good point. When you feel good about yourself, it tends to show. And that can definitely have a positive impact on your interactions with others.
It's like a ripple effect. And it makes you wonder if maybe this isn't just about hair. Maybe it's about self-care in general. If you're taking the time to look after yourself, it might signal to your partner that you're invested in the relationship.
That's an interesting perspective. And it makes sense. Actions often speak louder than words. Taking care of yourself can be a way of saying, I value you and I want to feel good for you.
But of course, communication and connection are still key, regardless of anyone's hairstyle.
Absolutely. Healthy relationships are built on a foundation of respect, trust, and genuine connection. You can have the most amazing hair in the world, but if you're not nurturing those deeper aspects of your relationship, it won't matter much in the long run.
Well said. So it's not just about the hair, it's about the whole package. And I think that brings us to an important question. This study focused on heterosexual married couples. Do you think these findings could apply to other types of relationships as well?
That's a fantastic question, and it's one that definitely deserves more research. While this study didn't explore those dynamics, it would be fascinating to see how these findings might play out in different relationship contexts.
Like, what about same-sex couples or unmarried partners? Do you think hair might play a similar role?
It's certainly possible, and it speaks to the complexity of human attraction and relationships. There are so many layers to unravel, and each layer offers unique insights.
It's a reminder that there's always more to discover.
Always.
Well, I think our brains are officially full of hair-related insights for one day. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I wanted to get your take on one final question. Based on this study and your expertise, what's one piece of advice you'd give to our listeners who are in relationships, regardless of their hair length or relationship status?
That's a great question. I think my advice would be to remember that attraction is multifaceted. It's a blend of physical, emotional, intellectual, and even spiritual elements. And while physical appearance can play a role, it's essential to cultivate those deeper levels of connection as well.
So don't just focus on the hair. Focus on the heart, the mind, and the soul as well. Because true beauty really does come from within.
I couldn't agree more. It's about being comfortable with yourself, embracing your unique qualities, and radiating confidence and authenticity. And if a little hair care helps you feel more confident and authentic, then go for it.
Exactly. But always remember that true attraction goes far beyond surface level stuff.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this fascinating exploration of hair and relationships.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to think about how all these different pieces fit together, when it comes to attraction and relationships. So just to recap, this study suggests that a wife's hair, specifically its length and quality, might have like a small but statistically significant impact on how often she and her husband have sex.
Right. And as we talked about, the researchers think this could be because of things like perceived attractiveness, the idea of signaling good genes, and even just cultural expectations around what's considered beautiful,
Yeah, totally. But it is important to remember that this is just one study, and it focused on a very specific population, heterosexual married couples in South Korea. So more research is needed to see if these findings hold up in other cultures and other types of relationships.
Exactly. And even within this particular study, the researchers were very careful to point out that the effect size they saw was relatively small.
Right. So, a new hairstyle might not hurt. It's probably not the key to a more fulfilling sex life. Communication, connection, all those other crucial elements of a healthy relationship. That's still the main course.
I couldn't agree more. This study really just offers a valuable reminder that attraction and relationships are multifaceted and complex. There's no simple formula. And what works for one couple might not work for another.
So true. It's about finding what works for you and your partner. And remembering that intimacy goes far beyond just physical appearance.
Absolutely. And maybe this study can serve as a jumping off point, for even deeper conversations about the things that really matter in our relationships.
I love that. So listeners, we'll leave you with this thought to ponder. This study focused on how a wife's hair might affect her husband's perception and desire. But what about the other side of that coin? How might a husband's grooming and appearance affect his wife's attraction and desire? Food for thought.
It is a great question. And it reminds us that relationships are a two-way street, with both partners playing a role in creating and sustaining that spark.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of hair and relationships.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, no matter what your hairstyle, the most important thing is to embrace your authentic self and nurture those deeper connections that make relationships truly meaningful.
Thank you for listening to the Sex Science Podcast brought to you by Luscious. We hope that you learned something new about the wonderful world of human intimacy and sexuality, and join us next time as we dive into more fascinating research. And remember, science is for you. Music for this podcast was produced by SOUNDRAW.